I'm on? I am on. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to LJ's Hot Potatoes in person. We started these a few years ago when things felt very volatile and polarized, and we really wanted to have sort of spaces for people to have a debate and ask questions and do it without judgment, a safe space, if you will. 6 years on, things are still pretty polarized, and what have you. There's still a need for this. We were online during COVID, and we had a few great debates in there. But there's really something special about having panelists in person, being able to sort of bounce off and feed off each other properly in the same room. But even more special that we can still bring those people in now from online to ask questions later and participate as well. I'm not going to talk any longer because I'm getting expectant looks from our chair. So I will throw over to Rebecca, and thank you very much and enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you everyone for coming. Those of you who braved to come out and be in person here at Finchley Progressive Synagogue, we're so delighted to welcome you and to welcome our panelists. And also those of you who are at home, I suspect there are more of you who have tuned in to be with us. And we will really endeavor that you are able to be part of the conversation. And indeed tonight, we will try very hard to allow the panelists to talk to each other as well as just to you, so that we have a lively debate. And I hope there will be difference of opinion on this panel. I don't normally read, but I really want to read the introductions of our four incredibly distinguished panelists that I think are going to bring so much to this conversation, and never has there been a moment right now, as there is, that makes the poignant need for conversations like these all the greater. So let me begin. On my left, going round to my right, I will introduce our panelists. I will then invite, once all the introductions are made, invite each of them to just speak for a moment, 5 minutes or so, a Jewish 5 minutes, to enable you to get a sense of who they are before we move more into discussion together. So I begin first with Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris, sociologist and writer, based here in London, North London, senior lecturer at Leo Baeck College, associate lecturer and honorary fellow at Birk College, project director of the European Jewish Research Archive at the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, has a broad range of interests, Keith has, including particular expertise in researching metal music scenes, which is very relevant for this tonight, but I want to bring it, and the UK Jewish community. So he has authored or co-authored 8 books, editor of several collections, articles, reviews, and his most recent books are The Babel Message, Love Letter to Language, and What Does a Jew Look Like, in collaboration with Rob Stothard. So we welcome you, Keith, and really pleased that you're here. Then on my left is Rabbi Lea Muehlstein, senior rabbi at the Ark Synagogue, so known well to us in the liberal community, but also the international chair of Artseinu, the political voice of reform, progressive and liberal religious Zionists. As chair of Artseinu, Lea works to represent the interests of Artseinu's constituent groups in 14 countries around the world, as well as progressive Jews more generally within the governing body of Israel's national institutions, the World Zionist Organization, Jewish Agency for Israel, Keren Kayemet Yisrael, Keren Hayesod. She's a member of the executive of the Jewish Agency, strong supporter of World Jewry, served on the board as a board member of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, and assistant treasurer of the European Union for Progressive Judaism. So you'd wonder she has time to be a rabbi as well, but believe me, she does. Then on my right is Dr. Yair Wallach, who is a social and cultural historian of modern Palestine and Israel, studying the entangled and relational histories of Jews and Palestinians. He's a reader in Israeli studies at SOAS University, where he is also chair of the Center for Jewish Studies. His work is focused primarily on visual and material culture and on the urban fabric, the sites and vehicles of contestation and transformation in late Ottoman and British Mandate Palestine. His book, A City in Fragments, Urban Text in Modern Jerusalem, won the Association for Jewish Studies Jordan Schnitzer Book Prize in 2022. He's also written on Israel, Palestine, and on anti-Semitism for The Guardian, Haaretz, and many other publications. We welcome you too, Yair. This is a special conversation tonight. And last but not least, Rabbi Leah Jordan, who has assured us she won't be delivering her baby tonight with us. She has 2 more weeks. Leah is Rabbi of Kehillah, North London, and is also Liberal Judaism's progressive Jewish chaplain for university students and young adults in the UK. Leah is also coordinator of Azara, opening the Bet Midrash, a new initiative creating Jewish text learning for everyone in the UK. This is a fantastic new initiative. She's a current and founding member of Na'amod, British Jews Against Occupation, a movement of British Jews dedicated to ending the Jewish communities here support for the occupation. Leah recently spent 3 years in Jerusalem, learning Torah and on-the-ground organizing as a fellow at both the Conservative Yeshiva and the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, as well as doing a year-long fellowship at Yeshivat Hadar in New York City. So as you can see, we have a very impressive panel, and we want to get going straight away to jump into this conversation. I'm going to just say the few questions that are on all our minds. What do the terms diaspora and Zion mean to each of you? Do we think the concept of Zionism, as we have known it, and as many of us in this room grew up with, is broken? These are the kind of questions that we would love for you to address. So I'm going to call on Leah first and move around the room.
Do I need to turn this on?
No.
Okay, great. Rabbi Rebecca, do you also want us to speak to those questions or talk more generally about how we intersect with this panel in this first kind of few minutes? What would be most helpful?
Maybe the latter.
Yeah.
Maybe the latter, but then build up to answering those questions.
Right. So as Rebecca said, I am Leah Jordan. I am the rabbi of Kehillah, North London, which is a lovely progressive community here in London in Stoke Newington. And I grew up, as you can hear, not in London. I grew up in Kansas City in the great Midwest of the United States of America, in a very involved, reform, progressive Jewish family who was in a chavurah and did festivals together every month with 10 other families. And I really loved that growing up, and that's what led me really to be a rabbi later in life. And also every summer I went to what feels very relevant to this panel, Camp Sabra, which was a traditional progressive Zionist summer camp that had originally been a chalutznik, a pioneer summer camp. And when it was called that, when it was really sending people in Aliyah, of course, it was called Camp Hawthorne, because we wanted to fit in the Ozarks, in the Lake of the Ozarks, which is a very rural Protestant white part of the country, actually. And we were the Jewish minority there every summer. And I remember every summer in the 90s, I would sing Hatikva and put up the Israeli flag. And they all told us, you have to go. And when you're 16, 17, you go to Israel. And then if you really can, you go for a gap year. And then you go into the military and you improve the state. And fast forward a few years, I didn't go that direction, but not exactly because I had any political thoughts about it or that were so subtle or interesting, but because I was into Torah and I was like a keen Jewish nerd and I wanted to be a rabbi. So I ended up in Jerusalem many years later after uni because I wanted to go and become a rabbi. So I knew very little about really that part of the world in the way that I think most of us don't, but especially North American Jews. It's a 12-hour flight from New York City to get to Jerusalem, and it's another 3-hour flight from Kansas City to get to New York, right? So it was a long way across the world, though a place that definitely the Jewish Community Center in Kansas City and the camp I grew up in talked about. I spent a year there studying Torah, and this was in the days not very long ago, but for my university students who I chaplain, it was the Stone Age. 2008, 2009, when they had Operation Cast Lead and they were finishing the separation barrier, the wall. And it was an interesting time actually in retrospect to be there, because I started kind of pulling on some threads by following around rabbis for human rights who were around on campus, on progressive Jewish campuses in Jerusalem, and really, I think, encountered the military occupation of the West Bank for the first time with my own eyes then. Went back again in 2014 to study Torah, went back actually earlier than that in 2010, 2011, kept on going back because I was, as they would say, Meshugala Davar, crazy about the thing, but the thing was Torah, and you could get it in Jerusalem. And kind of as a side thread, I ended up following along people that I knew in that world to the West Bank because I had several eye-opening experiences, one of which was being there in 2014 when there was the kind of one of the bigger flare-ups between Gaza militants and the Israeli military. And I experienced that as, all I can say is that my teachers, who were lovely people, and my student fellow classmates, who were also lovely people, all became what felt to me like right-wing warmongers in that moment. And it was a really eye-opening experience to kind of see that kind of bifurcation of people's identities. And I kept pulling on that thread and came back here and founded Na'amod, as Rabbi Rebecca said, because I felt like there needed to be a Jewish voice here in Britain that was saying, this is what we need to do. If we're going to talk about Israel, we need to talk about Israel very truthfully and honestly and morally, and say the occupation needs to end in the West Bank. And I can get into more later, but I then spent, as Rabbi Rebecca said, 2 years right before the pandemic living in East Jerusalem, in Arabic-speaking Palestinian East Jerusalem, with my sister who still lives there, and doing more on-the-ground organizing, and continue to find that a very important part of my rabbinate, and very happy to talk more about it.
Thank you, Leah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. First, I want to reassure everyone that this is not a nose job. I'm committed to my Jewish nose, and I'm not. So this is something. Okay, so I'm Israeli. I'm Israeli with a British citizenship, but I grew up in Israel, lived in Israel until my late 20s. I came to the UK for an MA, and I stayed for a PhD, and then got a position here in the university. There was no, for me, there was no decision to leave, but life led me in that direction. One thing interesting that, like I think most of me Israelis in the UK, I had very limited connection or relation to British Jewish community for a very, very long time. It's only, eventually, I had British Jewish friends, but it's really through my work in the university that I became more aware and connected. First, through just by our responsibility as lecturers, we have pastoral care responsibility of the students, and therefore it was important for me that to hear what Jewish students feel and so forth, especially when things became more heated and problematic, and that's the last 7 years, kind of more and more so. So it's through that and through, through Jewish students and through meeting other Jewish lecturers here, I became more involved with issues that historically I didn't think much about. I should say another thing here, that I remember the first time I went to the Association for Jewish Studies in the US conference, and for a long time I didn't really think of myself as doing Jewish studies even. And I realized when I got there how many preconceptions I was carrying with me from my Zionist education in Israel, and that kind of saw, Israel as the center of the world, and all the other Jews elsewhere are kind of an addendum. They're really trying, but they can't really live up to. And this is something really dormant in you, but it's something that you grow up. It's so strong, regardless of what your political views are, that's kind of how you grow up. And it only was when I was there, and it was kind of, I was not in my 20s anymore. I realized that, wait a minute, that the US and North America is the other big center of in the world. It's kind of, there's Israel and North America is as kind of parallel and on standing in a way, a very different kind of way of a legitimate way of Judaism, that it kind of, I was astounded, it never occurred to me that this is the situation, that I was so Israel-centric in that sense before that. So I think through that, I think what happened in the last few years is that I gained awareness and also a sense of respect and understanding to diaspora, Jewish diasporic existence of its many kinds that I think I didn't have before, and I think most Israelis don't have. And I'm still very much, I don't see myself as a diasporic Jew or even as a British Jew, because I did not grow up here. I didn't have the formative experiences that produce you as such. I'm very much Israeli, and my relationship with Israel is as a home, as the place that I grew up, and is still the most familiar and reassuring in a way for me to be there. And if it's about landscape or smells and food, or if it's about family and friends and that. So in that sense, I'm not a diaspora Jew, and I don't see myself as such, but I also can think of diasporic as different, interesting, something to learn from, and certainly something that is legitimate as Jewish Israeli existence. Okay, and I think I'll end just by saying that, if there is something that I find very disturbing is when people here or the US speak of Israel as an idea, as an idea that you hold on to. And I find it on a kind of almost a visceral way. I find it extremely annoying and fetishizing. I come from a real place, a real society. I want to be treated as such. I don't want to be fetishized as an abstract idea. Okay. And, and the good sides and the bad sides. But that's something I find really annoying.
Okay, we will definitely pull that out. Leah, thank you.
Thank you. So we're quite an international panel here this evening, actually. So I'll add the third country to our list. I think we're all born in different countries. Well, I don't know, Rebecca.
Keith and I probably.
So I was born in Germany into a Jewish family in Munich. And I would say we were a religious Zionist family, not in the way that you think of religious Zionism when you read the press now, but very much in the sense that I think many Jews living and growing up in the diaspora saw themselves in that their Zionism was tied in with their religious identity. So I grew up in a liberal Jewish family, politically very left-wing. My parents met at Amnesty International. We grew up as kids being real activists. I can't even remember the first time I went to when the first time was that I went to my first demonstration. That was a totally normal thing that we would do as children. We would go every 3 months or so with our little box for Amnesty International around all the houses to collect money and write letters to prisoners who had disappeared in South America. So that was in no way seen as a conflict to the idea that Zionism and a relationship to the state was key to our identity. Growing up in Germany, actually, interestingly for us, Israeli kind of Jewish culture felt much closer than Anglo-Jewish culture. Easy to forget when you speak English that there is a whole diaspora out there that doesn't get everything that you get in English. And I remember the first time I went to an American Reform service where they were singing in English. And I was like, oh my God, a church. And it wasn't because I hadn't grown up in a liberal family, and I really grew up in a liberal religious family, but it just felt very alien. And we, you know, our Judaism was infused with the tunes of the kibbutz movement and so on. I don't think I grew up ever with Israel as an idea. I grew up Israel very much as a real place we used to visit. When I was 16 years old, and I'll give my age away, in 19, my parents allowed me and my best friend, two 16-year-old girls, to go off to Israel for 3 weeks on their own, with nothing but an Egged bus pass, vouchers for the youth hostel, no mobile phone, and a bit of money in travelers' checks. And we really just explored Israel. We got on a bus at Damascus Gate and just went to Bethlehem. It was in those years when it was actually possible. It was after the Rabin assassination, but before the outbreak of the Second Intifada. And I guess my formative years were very much shaped actually by having experienced the hope of the Oslo Accords and seeing that hope dashed with the Intifada, being traumatized in my identity by the Gaza disengagement and how badly it was done. To this day, I struggle with wearing the color orange because that was the color adopted by the settler movement at the time. And anyone who followed this process of the Gaza disengagement will be familiar with all the imagery of the Holocaust that was used by the settler movement, which I think for me was particularly jarring as a German Jew. But I always saw Israel as part of my religious identity, not in a kind of just an idea kind of way, but as something that Judaism is also about. Judaism is also about, not just about religion and the theoretical idea of how the world should work, but putting that experiment into practice and testing it and failing at it. But actually seeing what is it like when we can rule as Jews, when we're not just powerless and don't have sovereign power, when we actually have the responsibility to handle power. So I think for me, that's still very much where I sit. I think I want to finish with a quote from May 1958. So when liberal Judaism I just recently finished writing an article about liberal Judaism's, the history of liberal Judaism's engagement with Zionism. And when liberal Judaism was discussing about should we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the State of Israel, the lead article in the Liberal Jewish Monthly, nowadays known as LJ Today, I hope you all read your copies back to front. You never know, they might be archived. In there it said, embracing the idea we should celebrate the State of Israel. They wrote, the Torah will go forth ever more strongly from Zion, even as we hope it will go forth equally from London, Paris, and New York.
That is a great quotation, 10 years into Israel's life. Keith.
Hi.
It's all on. You don't need to do anything.
Right, brilliant. Hi, everyone. So the first time I went to Israel was in 1980 when I was eight or 9 years old. I don't remember exactly. And we stayed in Herzliya Patuach, which at the time, my parents didn't speak Hebrew or any Hebrew really. But a couple of weeks in, I remember my mum saying, I just found out what Patuach means. And of course it means develop. And it made perfect sense because Herzliya Patuach at the time, not now, was scruffy. It had lots of empty lots. In the flat that we stayed in, it was self-catering, had cockroaches, and Israel had that scruffiness. One of the reasons why I think many of us at the time were so enthralled by Israeli soldiers is because, okay, they wore green and had guns, but they didn't really look like soldiers. They looked scruffy. And that was both one of the things I didn't like about Israel, but it was one of the things that really enthralled me about Israel too. And I think it is this sense of Israel as a work in progress that dragged me in. But I also think it's an idea that needs to die, both for myself and I think generally for Jews in the diaspora and possibly in Israel too. So I grew up going to Israel. We used to go to Eilat, like a lot of British Jews do. We used to go over Pesach. We visited my relatives who were in Ra'anana, who were incredibly hospitable and really lovely. And the guy there, my relative, my cousin David, was a developer, a real metaphor there, somebody who was building what was at the time a fairly scrappy sort of semi-suburb of Tel Aviv, and now is, of course, a very affluent suburb of Tel Aviv, full of South Africans and Anglos, not so much at the time. So I think I always had a sense of the Israel as an actual place, but that doesn't mean that I never saw Israel as an idea as well. And I was sort of sucked into it a little bit. I probably would have described myself as a Zionist. I didn't go on tour. But of course, everyone knows going on tour has nothing to do with Israel or Zionism, does it? In 1992, I went backpacking there, and we went to the sites. The reason we went to Yad Vashem is because there was a girl that I was really interested in, and I heard that she was going to Yad Vashem the next day, so that's why we went to Yad Vashem. So Israel was a real place. It wasn't a place that I saw with any great, although with a bit of reverence too, as well. What really changed things for me was in 1998, my metal and my Jewish lives did converge, and I did part of my PhD research on the Israeli metal scene. And whilst I wouldn't say that I never had contact with real Israelis before, I certainly had. What I hadn't done is met discontented Russian immigrants in a slum in Bat Yam talking about how they hate being in Israel and how they were Satanists. I certainly hadn't been to East Jerusalem to meet an Assyrian Christian who was in an anti-Christian black metal band called Melakesh. I certainly hadn't done those sorts of things. And that, weirdly enough, brought me closer to Israel at the same time as it drew me further away from Zionism. And I thought for quite a few years that I could be someone who loves Israel, but is, if not agnostic about Zionism, certainly recognizes its problems. And certainly by that stage, I knew a lot more than I had done. I knew, for example, that those empty lots you used to see across Israel weren't always empty lots. There had been people there who had been living there. People hadn't left just for the hell of it. That's the sort of thing. In the early 2000s, I did a program in Israel for a year, and I learned Hebrew, so learning it at the age of 30 was bloody difficult. But again, it brought me a lot closer to Israel. It brought me a lot closer to a kind of love for the Hebrew language, which these days is probably 90% of my Zionism, insofar as I define myself as a Zionist at all. But here's the thing. For the last few years, I have felt that Israel as that scrappy place no longer exists. You often hear in Hasbara sometimes saying, Israel is a young state, give us time. And actually that's not true. Israel is older than many. I don't know if it's most of the nations in the world, certainly older than most of the nations in Africa, certainly older than Kazakhstan or Estonia or places like that. Israel, and in that context, seemed to have the open-endedness that it once did, and it doesn't have the implicit message that you too, in the diaspora or in Israel, can play a part in it. I believe that now parts have been permanently closed off. There are certain directions Israel can no longer go in. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, the sort of sense of crisis in a lot of diaspora communities, is based on a recognition of that not everything is possible anymore, that Israel is no longer the place that I thought it was in Herzliya Patuach in 1980.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Leah, thinking of Keith talking about those early days in Herzliya Batuach and Leah talking about liberal Judaism, which is famously considered to have been anti-Zionist, and here you were finding that really intriguing quote, which cuts right to where we are tonight. I'm right now going to ask four of you for one-word answer, if you are able to give it, just because I think it will cut our long, wordier questions which are necessary. Is Zionism broken? Leah.
Yes.
I think it's an irrelevant category.
Irrelevant category, Zionism.
I think it's not helpful.
Okay, so maybe that's a yes. Leah? No. Keith?
Don't care.
Okay, thank you. So
I'll explain what I mean by that.
okay, but not right now. So we are here tonight because these almost 75 years on, considering the Declaration of Independence, the commitments that were given, for those of us that recall those words, have we lost our way? The question tonight is, could the diaspora replace Israel as the new Zion, as the new center of Klal Yisrael? So I'm going to ask that question in different ways so that we keep ourselves fresh tonight, but I'm going to begin with you, Leah.
So I'll tell a little story, which seems to be, for better and for worse, the Jewish impulse on this panel. So as I said, I grew up in a liberal Zionist household in Kansas City, going to liberal Zionist summer camp. And then I was in Jerusalem until the pandemic for those 2 years. And I was at yeshiva during the week, davening 3 times a day at an egalitarian yeshiva in Jerusalem, and then going to Masa for Yatta in the South Hebron Hills in the occupied West Bank, south of Hebron, in the weekends, to stand in solidarity with people who are now, especially with this far-right government, going to be forcefully expelled from their homes, and were being forcefully expelled from their homes at that time, settler military community. And I would get beat on by the military on those Fridays and then go back to yeshiva on the following Sunday. And I had a dream, genuinely a literal dream, at one point, that the Mashiach had come, the Messiah had. And so now on the Temple Mount, the 3 faiths that cared about that place all had a space where they daven, because of course that's what the prophets say will happen, right? So there was the call to prayer for Islam still happening from the Mount, and there was apparently Christian services, though my brain didn't get into that. The Jewish call to prayer 3 times a day in this kind of shofar temple-like way. And yet somehow the world was still broken, very Talmudic, right? Somehow the Mashiach had come, and yet there was still the need to be in Masa for Yatta and to get beat on by the military in this dream. And I'm walking in outside of Jerusalem, looking out onto the Temple Mount, and the call to afternoon prayer for the Jews comes out, and it's this particular chazan. And I turn to my neighbor, and my neighbor goes, there's like some politics around him. He's like Sephardi, and some people like that he does this in this style, but he's got bad politics. And that was the dream. And I woke up, and I tell you this because I think if it exists in that dream. And I'm always interested in Rabbi Leah saying, I'm going to reclaim religious Zionism. But I sit here thinking, that's also why I identify as a non-Zionist, though I'm with you, Yair, and would like to hear more about, is Zionism a useful category? Because I think that anecdote perhaps expresses where I am on all of these things, in the sense that I don't think that Zionism has built the place that we wanted, and it's not going to get us to that Temple Mount, perhaps.
And stopped your love for the country?
I'm invested, and I don't know if that's like something that predates having any of these thoughts, right? Like, I'm deeply entwined. My sister lives there. I've spent years of my adult life there. I have lots of loved ones there. And so I hope, thankfully, that it's not an idea, that it's a real place to me. And yeah, I'm intertwined regardless of what I want.
Thank you, Leah. Why is the term defunct?
Mainly, first of all, it's always interesting argues about Zionism. Nobody, people have moved on. It's only outside that people kind of beat themselves up about what are they still, are they not, and I think it means different things to different people in a way that is harmful for the conversation. So someone who grew up Jewish here and in their 20, and their sense of Zionism is having this kind of attachment to Israel and whatever, and has this kind of Zionist identity that means something. A Palestinian whose family has been driven out in a very different ways of Zionism, when they don't talk about the same thing at all. So it's a category that masks the reality today, and it's kind of, I think I don't really care if people, whatever, how they define themselves. I do care what they think about actual oppression, actual threats that we hear of wiping up villages, about regimes of discrimination. I don't care if you think that there can be some kind of ideal Zionism that is perfect. Okay, fine. But that's not what's there, and that's not what's been there for a long time. So about that.
So I'm just going to counter with a question. Would you agree that the diaspora Jewish community, particularly the traditional end, has at times used their Zionism or support of Israel to silence critique, dissent, and concern? So in that way, Zionism ends up being more important in the diaspora, strangely, than it does in Israel, you're saying.
Yeah, no, I think it's a painful debate, and yeah, I think there's a lot of silencing and excluding that is going on related to where people stand on this debate. I mean, you could see it in the Jewish Book Week, who gets a place, who gets invited, and who doesn't. I mean, the extreme right voices are, the left or the non-Zionist aren't. Or they are invited, but they can't talk about Israel and Zionism.
That's good to stop there for a moment. Leah does indeed talk about reclaiming religious Zionism, and I have asked Leah more than once about how this is particularly relevant for our young people in our movement, but young people in the diaspora, who at times, I would say now, are ashamed, are distancing themselves from Israel, and really Leah's hope and promise is important, and we want to hear in what way do you think Zionism is relevant, important in this moment where we are now, with Netanyahu arriving on Friday morning to London with the most extraordinary demonstration plans already in place for Friday. Things have never been this active or engaged. So what can you say to that right now?
So I think for me, so the reason why I think Zionism isn't broken is that I don't think the way I understand Zionism is that Zionism is one thing. There are many Zionisms that are broken, but Zionism is a political movement in my understanding. It's certainly how it saw itself when it was when it began in the 19th century, when it was not we all agree on ABC, but we are left-wing Zionists and we are right-wing Zionists, and actually we have extremely passionate discussions and debates, and sometimes they're civil, and a lot of the times, unfortunately, they're not civil. So I sit around the table of the Zionist institutions in Israel, and not always do you have a table, but often do you get things thrown at you from other Zionists. And sadly, it's not just the right-wing Zionists behave really despicable, it's also the left-wing Zionists who sometimes behave really despicably. So there's a lot of in that also. I think for me that it really ultimately it's about this question of political sovereignty, of do we trust ourselves as the Jewish people to actually take responsibility for the power that we have? And the reality is, whatever we think, whether we want to be a Zionist or not a Zionist, we know in Israel as Jews we have power. And therefore we need to relate to that power. And for me, therefore, being a Zionist is part of my social justice activism. I cannot turn away and pretend I and my people don't have that power. And okay, I might have slightly less power than potentially than an Israeli on the street, but that's often misleading, because actually there are a lot of attention is paid to the voice of diaspora within Israeli political discourse. It's and there's horribly like name dropping, but I don't have many of my Israeli friends who have the president of Israel's WhatsApp phone number and know that he will actually pick up the call, which he will with me, right?
So WhatsApped him tonight.
I could
and
WhatsApp him.
Told him where you were.
He sends really, really dodgy emojis in response. But the reality is, I once asked like one of my cousins, like, oh, you know, do you also get really bored when you get invited to another, you know, with the president? And he was like, I don't get invited for dinner with the president. So we have power, right? The reason why I'm telling that story is not because I'm so glorious. There are many people who have, it's a real problem for Bougie that he gives out his mobile phone number to too many people apparently. But it's because we have power. And for me, it would be an abdication of that power if I would ignore it.
So Leah,
we need to engage with that power.
Can I ask you that? Because obviously you sit in the higher echelons of power, and we're really glad that you, as a liberal rabbi operating here in the UK, have that access. Something that we visibly and audibly hear is those who say nothing as a Jew if you do not live in Israel. You have no right to speak. And yet you're saying, on the contrary, it is our responsibility to speak, to express opinions, audibly, publicly, as well as privately.
Absolutely, I absolutely believe in that. I mean, that's how I grew up. You know, what business did I have having an opinion as a 6-year-old girl about prisoners in Argentina disappearing? What business did I have, right? But I had a business because I was a human being with a conscience, and my parents believed things would make a difference. And so I feel I have a business. I personally don't believe in this argument that if you criticize Israel publicly, you will, you know, confirm all the anti-Semite stereotype and will bring anti-Semitism on you. Anti-Semites don't need Jews to hate Jews. It's one thing that history has definitely taught us. Many countries that are the most anti-Semitic countries have no Jews, have no knowledge of Jews, and they still are filled with anti-Semites. So I don't believe in that. I think we have to face the truth. We have to see things firsthand. We should not be naive. So I'm proud that I have a Palestinian friend who says, I hate my Israeli passport. That has never stopped me being friends with her. I totally understand why she hates her Israeli passport. She hates her Israeli passport because as a Palestinian, Israel discriminates against her, excludes her. Even if she would want to demonstrate for democracy, which, by the way, to most of the Palestinians seems like a farce, because left-wing Israelis now demonstrating for the democracy that they had, which Palestinians haven't experienced in Israel, even in Israel proper on the whole. So she hates her passport because of that, but she also hates her Israeli passport because she's a wonderful actress, and she's like, never gonna win a film award in Sharm el Sheikh. Because why is an Arab country going to give an Israeli citizen a film award? I totally understand why she hates her passport. I have to face that. I have to say, okay, we need to work. I need to understand how can we work together to get to somewhere better.
Okay.
And I can hear what Keith is saying. We maybe should give up on that hope, but I guess this is my belief in messianic world. My messianic idea in Judaism is not that the Messiah will come, but that we have to keep working on it.
Okay, thank you, Leah. So Keith, you seem to have said we should give up on the idea. Do you want to flesh that out more?
Look, the reason why I said don't care was partly because I resented the question.
No, not that question.
You asked whether Zionism was broken.
Yeah.
I said, I don't care. I want to explain why I said that.
Yeah, but the question I'm asking you now is that earlier in your introduction, you said you feel the idea no longer has life in it.
No, I don't. That's what I said. What I said was that certain paths have been closed off and closed off permanently. Israel is not an open-ended experiment. Until recently, this was Netanyahu's genius, right? If you were under government he headed, it was possible just about for those who wanted a maximal two-state solution to think they still had skin in the game. It was possible just about for those who, more than just about, for those who wanted to ethnically cleanse the territories to think they had still skin in the game. And he kept that going for a very, very long time because it was a very good way of keeping Israel within the international community, keeping the diaspora more or less inside. I think for some years it has been clear that at least a two-state solution that is two equal states is not going to happen and cannot happen without things that are not going to happen. That doesn't mean, though, that we do not still have, to use the phrase again, skin in the game. We will always have skin in the game. What happens in a Jewish state will always be of interest to Jews, and therefore, to involve ourselves is appropriate. I think, though, that the reason why the question annoyed me about that Zionism is broken is, well, for several reasons. One is it was redolent, although I don't think this is how you meant it, of kind of loyalty tests, like are you a Zionist or not? And I will never answer that question. It was also redolent the question, do you believe in God? And I will answer that, I militantly don't care, right? There are certain things where debate is so stuck that it is impossible to answer in that kind of way. And so I don't answer. But I have to say, the other reason the question annoyed me is Zionism broke? These are great days. If you're a Kahn-Harris, these are great days. That's Zionism. Okay, it's true to an extent what Yair is saying, but Israelis do sometimes talk about Zionism. And Yair would describe himself as a Zionist. They've got an opportunity now to do something truly extraordinary, a maximal Zionism that a certain kind of Jew has long dreamed of, right? That kind of Zionism is vibrant, it's dynamic, and it is absolutely authentic Zionism. But I also believe that all kinds of, I am against politics of authenticity. Zionism is just, I believe that if you say you're a Zionist, if you write about Zionism, congratulations, you're a Zionist, right? There are forms of Zionism that I find morally repellent, but I'm not saying that they're not authentic. So yeah, it may be that a particular kind of diaspora liberal Zionism is being rapidly undermined to the point where it may break apart. Absolutely true. But so long as people call themselves Zionists, there will be Zionism.
So a reminder for all of us that tonight's topic is about Zionism and the diaspora. So I'm sorry you were surprised by the question, but I think what we want to do now is to really consider how you, our panelists, might see the mending of the state. We've established everyone is very entwined, using Leah's words, very entwined, and cares deeply about. So let me ask that question first to you, Yair. What do you think would need to happen to see recovery, to see growth or a thriving of a multiculturally respectful, just, democratic, maybe, although I really take what Leah's saying, that maybe democracy hasn't always been there in such a successful form. What would you say to that?
It's okay. It's kind of impossible to answer that, but we are in a moment that is in some ways the most frightening in many decades, because there is a real possibility of Israeli government launching, a kind of civil war within Israel and the occupied territories as a way to expel Palestinians, and we can think of various nightmare scenarios, which were not possible 10 years ago, but seem really possible today. So it's a incredibly frightening moment. At the same time, it also feels a promising moment, I have to say, because the madness of the last few weeks in Israel and the putsch attempt, effectively, kind of sort of a regime change, the end of the Israeli Republic and a new form of, this kind of illiberal democracy, which has been some time in the making, but still kind of moved very rapidly and met a real backlash that has many forms and is a moment of confusion for many people. And that confusion is productive, I think, because it allows those who say that, that there is no democracy with a 55-year-old occupation. There is no democracy with Jewish supremacy. Those voices which have been really relegated to the margins are now more vocal. They're not the majority by any chance, but because people are confused and they're rethinking Israelis are thinking the relationship with the state, that is a moment of potentially opportunity.
Okay.
That's what I would say. There is no clear path going forward, and still the likelihood of things getting terrible is bigger. And it's still, completely open. I guess, I think, so it's very difficult to see. I like Keith, I think that, a two-state solution, etc. It's not a possibility anymore. Doesn't seem to me an extremely unlikely scenario. So therefore, thinking ahead, we can think of various but beyond the frameworks, principled recognition of equality and democracy as principles that extend to all the people that live there is fundamental to any kind of future. And I think that's kind of where,
Okay. Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you, Yair. So, Leah, do you want to respond to Yair? And then
I
I
would
have
love
a question
to-
for Leah.
I would love to respond to that. So I think two things about what Yair was saying. I think there's not just the risk that the current government is trying to expel Palestinians. I think the greater risk is actually it's trying to expel secular Israelis. I think actually they're loving the current talk that is really happening. When I was a few weeks ago in Israel with a random host family of the wonderful Reform Synagogue in Caesarea that I was at, they were all talking at the Friday night dinner table about should they make use of their second citizenship and move out. And I think actually the right wingers are loving that, right? Get rid of these pesky Tel Avivian, Caesarea and whatever coast secular Israelis, although they'll then discover that the economy will collapse. But, so I think that is also at risk. I do think one of the things I think that we've seen in Israel, and it's not just true for Israel, I think it's true in a lot of places. I think the problem of the left is that we always say it's complicated and there's no solution. And I think what we need, and I do see that there is hope that people are starting to wake up from this, is we do actually need to start saying, actually, it's not complicated. There are certain values we believe in, and we need to start practicing what values we believe in. And that can
Do you mean us in the diaspora?
and people in Israel. I think it needs to be us in the diaspora too, but I think it needs to be people in Israel. And I think for far too long was it possible for a secular Israeli to pretend that Palestinian citizens and Palestinians of the West Bank didn't lead radically different lives to what they were leading. And the talk of there is no partner on the Palestinian side, there are lots of Palestinian people who are happy to talk. You just need to listen. And I think there is a little bit of actually saying, let's forget about all the big picture things, and people need to start and sit together and listen to each other. Grassroots listening is one of the ways that we can actually start understanding what solutions might look like. I also agree, I think this vision of the two-state solution in the classic sense is probably over, but I don't think the vision of a diplomatically negotiated, on both sides agreed answer is over. I don't think it has to be one overpowers the other. Okay. I don't think that is necessarily the case.
Thank you, Leah. So I'm going to invite you to think if you have a question ready. But first I want to ask Leah, after our hiatus of 2 years, we sent our first tour of 16-year-olds to Israel last year and again this year. So I just want to ask you, yes, do you think we should be doing it? And do you think we should be doing it any differently now? So the diaspora tours of young people that are the pinnacle of our youth movement experience. So all our youth movements are Zionist in that way. What difference and how important is it that our young people go?
This is something I've been thinking about a lot because, of course, as a rabbi of a synagogue in London, there are, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are asking, to go on Israel tour and that we're helping fund and that kind of thing. And I think in the first instance, I think Keith is right. Is tour really about Israel? Has it ever really been about Israel? So in the first instance, as the university chaplain, I think there should be great experiences for Jewish youth that age that are meaningful, where they all get together and they're part of community. I don't know that it should look like Israel tour. I feel very ambivalent about, certainly I do not like Israel tour as it used to be constructed, and if it's going to remain, it needs to really shift. This is something I've been thinking a lot about for myself. I know that most of my diaspora Jewish leftist friends would say, throw Israel tour in the trash, and I have actually a lot of time for that because of some of the things we've been discussing. I think we've done it in a way that has not been well thought out at the best, and at the worst has actually probably been complicit in some of the things that have led to this moment. So it needs a big rethink is the answer, and I don't know, again, kind of like Yair said with the question of what do we do in Israel-Palestine in general, what do we do with Israel tour? It's a really hard question to answer because it's so deeply culturally embedded in what we do. So I would love to think more with everyone about...
you've opened up our thinking.
Yeah.
Can I see if there's a question? I'm going to start with David. Hold on 1 sec, and then people at home, and then maybe Charlie, Rabbi Charlie Baginski, who I know is hosting Zoom along with our Josie Kinchin. Maybe if you have a question from anyone on Zoom, then we can include those at home. David.
Yeah, this is not really a question, it's just an observation. It's in relation to something that I read about recently that really resonated with me. And in a sense, it's about the idea of Zionism and the word Zionist or Zionism. And it's in a sense been demonstrated by the difficulties we've had in this discussion so far. And it is such a loaded word and idea and means such different things to different people. If you take on the extreme end, maybe you're a real extreme religious Zionist, as compared with, say, a liberal Zionist, you know, very, very different ideas. And the idea that was floated, and I grabbed it because I thought it was handy for me and it might be handy for others, is do we really need to use this word anymore when we're, for example, talking about Israel's current position? So the idea would be this was a movement. This was about the creation of the state of Israel. But once you got to that point and the state has been created, if you're having a discussion like, you know, what can we do about the current position in Israel? What should the diaspora be doing? We could almost take the idea and the word Zionist out of it so that we don't have this sort of, is Zionism broken, and the sort of heat that that brings with it. You just deal with the country and what it's doing and what it isn't doing.
Okay, thank you, David. So I'm going to let Keith, will you do a short response, Keith? And then I see 2 questions there.
I think paradoxically, one of the things that keeps the term Zionism alive is the fact that it is a term of abuse, sometimes anti-Semitic abuse, in some circles. And it's, needless to say, massively counterproductive. And certainly it may be that people may not know what they mean by saying they're a Zionist, but the reaction to anti-Zionists is often so visceral that it means that you take hold of the term as almost like it's a lifebelt.
Thank you. Yeah, and then
I think just on Zionism, it occurs in the book of Samuel, and David conquered Zion, the same as Jerusalem. It's just a shorthand for Jewish nationalism. But a question I'd like to ask the rabbis, and we have 3 rabbis on here, is based on the fact, quite simply, of God. I haven't heard God mentioned. I know it's a difficult word, but as rabbis, I expect you to deal with God and to talk about God. And as far as I'm concerned, the Jewish people are very much under the protection of God, and the land of Israel is on the protection of God. As you know, in Devarim, Deuteronomy, God has got his eyes on the land of Israel 24/7, from one end of the year to the other. And I would ask you whether you believe that the land of Israel is under the eyes of God, whether the Jewish people are under protection of God, and whether you think, as I do, that they are only under the protection of God in that land, that the Torah does not extend to London, New York, or Peckham. That's really my question to you.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay. Leah, I'm going to invite you to just have a short response. Well, I always call you Leah and you Leah.
Okay. So I think I'm going to go with Micah on this one. What does God require of you? Only to act justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I don't think Micah just talks about that being restricted to one place. So I think on your final question, does the Torah only extend to the land and God only extend to land? I think that is very firmly not the Jewish way. The Shekhinah went with us into exile right from the first Babylonian exile. I firmly believe in that. So we might be seeing things differently here. I think there's also a difference between being under the eyes of God and being under the protection of God. I do consider myself as being under the eyes of God. I really do see myself it very much reflected in that Micah quote, that I am held accountable to a higher power, to act justly and love mercy and to walk humbly with my God. I think, if anything, that makes it harder for us. I think for me, that is why I apply somewhat of a double standard when I'm thinking about Israel versus when I'm thinking about China. because actually I really care. And I think actually God told us something about what should happen when you are in charge of a country. And I take that very, very seriously. But God and God's Torah also said the land will vomit you out. And I take that very seriously too. The earth will vomit us out, by the way, too. Climate change will potentially do that for us. So it's definitely not restricted to the land, but I do feel an obligation of God for me on that as well, and on that relationship as well. That's why I say I'm a religious Zionist, not just a Zionist. I'm not just a political Zionist.
Thank you, Leah. I'm going to let Leah have answered that question. Yes.
Thank you. I want to point out first of all, that Israel is a young country. I say this as somebody who's considerably older than Israel. And if you say it's not a young country, that's really quite a problem for me. But in my growing up, Zionism was something that was very prominent in my life. Not that I was ever or wanted to be a Zionist, but I was brought up in a North London environment in which the concept of Zionism was taught to me as being the idea that Jews should live in Israel. We were the diaspora. Whether the diaspora had a future was a serious question. It possibly didn't. We should all be going to Israel. I never subscribed to that, but it was really what Zionism meant in the world that I grew up in. It clearly doesn't mean that to anybody here now. The notion was connected, of course, to Zionism in relation to the diaspora and to the Holocaust, and to the law of return. And the law of return was a very fundamental part of the state of Israel. The idea of Israel as a refuge, as a haven, as a safe place for Jews in a hostile world was tremendously important. And it was that notion which made me, as a non-Zionist, go and offer myself as somebody to help in the Six-Day War, and my wife as well, who wasn't even recognized by Israel as Jewish under the law of return as it was then. This was what it was about. It was about saving the safe haven and protection of the diaspora. Israel was there for us. I don't know that anybody here has even that thought doesn't seem to have been present anymore. It's gone. One element that changed things was the change of the law of return. When Israel was formed, 1950, the law of return, quite simple. Anybody who had a Jewish mother was automatically enrollable as an Israeli citizen. Just after the Six-Day War, in 1970, that changed fundamentally. Now, anybody who has a Jewish grandfather is enrollable under the law of return. This means that now, of the 25.5 million people who are entitled to citizenship under the law of return, 40% belong to another religion. That changes the whole nature, relationship of the diaspora Jewish community to Israel. And I think that is what is broken, gone, over, will never come back. And Israel is now, as we have been told, really not much to do with us. What do you think?
Okay, I'm going to let Leah respond to that before we ask whether there's a question at home.
So I recognize we didn't speak about Israel as a safe haven. I think that is the privilege of living in England. If we would be sitting in Ethiopia or in Russia right now, things would be looking very, very different.
Or even in France.
Potentially even in France. As Rebecca said in the intro, I sit on the board of the Jewish Agency for Israel. Every board meeting, we very, very seriously discuss the very significant threats that the Jewish community is under in different parts of the world. And there are still many thousands of people arriving in Israel who really do come there to seek refuge. I think the fact that the grandchild clause and the question of people of another religion, I think it's a little bit of a red herring, because actually the law of return says that if you are of another religion, that disqualifies you from the grandchild clause. You have to not be professing to another religion, otherwise you are not automatically eligible to Aliyah anymore. It's simply not true that those people would be eligible for Aliyah. It's part of what the right-wing government currently is pandering. It simply isn't the practice. I can tell you, as somebody who is dealing with a lot of immigration requests and details.
The percentage of Jews in Israel dropped from 80% to 175%.
It's now at 67%, I believe. Well, it's partly to do with the fact that the state that the state has relegated religion to the ultra-Orthodox, and it means that people who consider themselves Jewish are not recognized as Jewish in the statistics.
Thank you. I'm going to stop there
Simply
and let
that.
Yair jump
And
in.
also birth rates and Arab population and so on. But yes.
You're saying self-identification is...
There are many people who would love to be recognized by the state as Jews, who are denied that opportunity. I can give you an example of, there's a famous Israeli TV presenter and singer, children's TV presenter and singer. She has been in the Orthodox Chief Rabbinate's conversion program for 3 years. They will not permit her to convert because she is a woman who sings for her job. She has a Jewish father.
Thank you, Leah. Yair, do you want to add anything to that?
I'll say something maybe provocative. I think there's something very unhealthy about the idea of a safe haven today in 2023, and because, and I'm not talking about exceptional cases. So people fleeing Russia, etc., at Putin, but to think that Israel is this kind of shelter for 8 million, potentially 12 million, I don't know how many people, that, it will get really bad in the US, so Jews I mean, these are ridiculous scenarios. And because if things go bad for Jews in the US, then it won't be good in Israel as well. But also the idea that a state is continuously in limbo waiting for millions of people potentially to arrive is not a healthy situation to be, even if it's never going to happen. Psychologically, the idea that, I remember I heard it from a guy that said, he was Australian, and said, oh, it's so good that there's Israel. I feel safe that there's a place I could go. And that person was in his 30s, he never went to visit there. I felt I, as an Israeli, should wait there and keep the food for this guy to suddenly appear because he feels, this is not fair towards Israelis to expect them to play that role.
Can I mention,
Thank you. Yeah,
I just want to mention one thing. We haven't mentioned climate change yet. That really, you did mention it, sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, it screws up the idea of safe havens. And the idea of a safe haven being a crowded place with a massive problem with water and heat seems to be a little bit on the optimistic side.
Thank you, Keith. I'm going to see if anyone at home, Charlie, if you would like to ask a question on behalf of those at home.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, panelists. There's a question here which asks, there are liberal Jewish thinkers who have said Judaism means seeking happiness beyond the state, not seeking to embrace a state ideology, and also that the communities of Jews in Israel exist within the exile. What are the panelists' responses? And it ties in a little bit, I'm going to ask Susan's question as well, which is there hasn't really been much talk about diaspora as an alternative centre, as alluded in the question behind this this panel. I'm not sure, she says, I'm not sure I believe the diaspora is a single centre, but can the panelists explore this some more?
Okay, thank you, Charlie. Let's take that question then that we are gearing up for. Can the diaspora be a different centre for Klal Yisrael? Can it yield the same pulse, the heart pulse that Israel maybe once did? Leah.
So obviously I've been thinking about this over the course of the panel, and also thinking, as the person who asked this was thinking, we haven't really gotten to this, the heart of this, as much as we could. While feeling entwined, as I said to Rebecca's question, with Israel-Palestine, and a sort of sense of people there and experiences there and upbringing that targeted me toward there, I am very much a diasporist in the sense of what I spend my time doing professionally. I'm just thinking about my rabbinate. My rabbinate is split between doing chaplaincy for liberal Judaism, rabbiing for Kehillah North London and Stoke Newington, and working on Azara, this yeshiva that's going to be for a month in Edinburgh. And when we announced that we were doing a month-long yeshiva in Edinburgh this July, the Scotsman ran a piece saying, the first yeshiva in Scotland, and it's in 2,000 years. I think they meant ever, but I guess that was the length of time they could have imagined there possibly being a yeshiva that could have existed. And I say all this to say, yes, I think the diaspora is beautiful and incredibly vibrant. And as I experienced it in the United States, very much so. I lived in New York City, and I've lived in Los Angeles, and I've grew up, as I said, in Kansas City, and all of those places had brilliant Jewish life. And I think that the diaspora has a huge amount to say for itself. And I spend all my professional hours putting time into making it meaningful and beautiful, and it is. It gives back in that way. So that's I guess an answer to that question.
Thank you, Leah. So I don't know whether anyone else on the panel wants to respond to the idea that Judaism could be refreshed and developed without the lifeblood of Israel, seeing it coming from all these countries in the diaspora.
So I think we have to recognize the reality that over the last few decades, the paradox that the existence of Israel has actually helped to revive Jewish life over here, in the sense that post-67, it did inject a certain confidence into diaspora communities. Now, whether or not that confidence was warranted, or it was built on sand, or it was never going to last, is a different question. But it certainly did have that effect. I think what I would argue for, though, is that there is a tendency sometimes to fetishize diaspora, just as there is a tendency to fetishize Israel. I tend to be a diasporist, except when I read diasporists or talk about this sort of, like, particularly a certain kind of left tradition, which in other respects I'm quite sympathetic to, that keeps talking about the Bund without talking about quite why the Bund doesn't exist anymore, or barely exists anymore. I think really the concept of here and there, diaspora and Israel, probably needs to be collapsed. And to some extent, it is collapsing, because Jewish life is its most vibrant when it is Jewish life on a global scale. So when it works together, and that is one of the things that was probably not possible when Israel started, that is possible now. When you went to Israel, and then 20 years later, you might have got a phone if you're lucky. Today, Israel is highly interconnected. And so that sense of Israel being a permanent condition, Zion being a permanent condition, and diaspora being a temporary condition doesn't really make much sense. And you mentioned France before. it's quite interesting that there has been a significant move to find in Israel a safe haven from French Jews, because they're justifiably worried. But from what I hear, a lot of people are hedging their bets, starting businesses in Israel, but commuting from France, or having some of the family in Israel, some of them in France. And that's probably how things are probably going to pan out, possibly in reverse as well, with Israeli families perhaps spread across different countries. And I think that would probably...
So you think the rigid terms, which is interesting for us to be, and I see there's a question in the front row, that the rigid terms of Zion or Zionism and diaspora could be folded.
What about Jews? What about Jews is, to me, something that I care about much more than Israel or diaspora.
I don't particularly like the idea of center. I don't think that it's true that there is like centers. I think of course we have always seen Jewish life flourish, whether there was Israel or not. We've also seen it being threatened and persecuted. And I think it's often easy when you sit in London or in New York or in LA to think that there's so much Jewish vibrancy. It's quite different when you live somewhere where, you know, the nearest Jewish community is 300 miles away and there is no Jewish learning, or you speak a language where there are no online resources. But I don't think there is, I think this idea that there is one center in a globalized world, I think doesn't make sense.
Okay, thank you, Leah. So hold on, microphone's coming so those at home can hear.
Hiya. It was basically like the fact that I was surprised when I heard today that I think it was like a general thought that Jewish youth are turning more away from Israel, only because over the last few years at university, in UJS, in Young Labour, in New Labour, what I've been seeing is a growing adoption of the concept of new anti-Semitism and the growing conflation between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and the witch hunting of students, including Jewish students, and particularly POC, Palestinian and Muslim students who speak out against Israel's apartheid regime. So, I mean, and especially with what we've seen with what's happened recently with the NUS report, I was just wondering where all of you were seeing this, because what I'm getting the feeling is, what feeling I'm getting is that diaspora Jewish students are growing further lost to the fetishistic concept of Israel as a utopia.
Absolutely, thank you. Great question. I'm going to let Leah, who obviously chaplain for progressive Jewish students, answer.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, I think about this quite a lot. One thing I wanted to repeat is what Yair made the point about at the beginning, which is that on one hand, we're in an unprecedented, frightening moment. And I think that's why you see, in some ways, the student movement responding very loudly and having this fight. And also, it's a moment that if you're surprised that it's come, then you haven't been paying attention. So it's this combination kind of experience. And I just want to kind of pull a thread there together around that. That this moment has meant that there has also been a big shift amongst Palestinian communities, and Palestinian comrades say to me, basically since spring 2021 and the violence and the political uprising then, that they are not comfortable organizing, and I hear this over and over, and I think a lot of us probably do, with people who cannot identify with anti-Zionism, right? And the way that they experience that, the way they say that is they say that because they feel that if you're not able to say I'm anti-Zionist, what they hear in that is, I, as a Palestinian, am going to have to come and explain my suffering to you and justify it. That is how that experience is understood. And I think, again, that is a dynamic that I understand, that's understandable to me, and that is really been a difficult one, a good, constructive one in some ways, and also a difficult one in the student movement, right? Because then you have this bifurcation where there is a Jewish part of the community that, because of ignorance and because of the politics that many of us grew up with, cannot understand that, because the way that we experience anti-Zionism and that label in the Jewish community, as I think it was Keith that said it, or was it Rabbi Leah, someone, when you say that word, people lose their minds, right, in the Jewish community. And that's because I don't think we understand that the label, as it means for students and for Palestinian communities, is a label about there should be no ethno-nationalist state. If Richard Spencer, the American white supremacist, can come on Israeli news and say, I want a state like your state, Israeli Jews, that's an acknowledgement of this odd paradigm that we also have been kind of discussing here on a meta level, which is that here we are a minoritized community who is sometimes under threat. I think that's true in the diaspora in general. And there we are part of a supremacist and a increasingly Kahn-Harris, fascist, supremacist Jewish reality. And that's also, again, hard in the student movement to hold all of those things together. And so finally, I've been thinking more about this Israel tour question and this student question of how should we as people who are part of university student life engage? I think the diaspora Jewish left is having this conversation. How do we engage in Israel-Palestine in a way that feels consistent with our values? And most people that I respect and listen to are saying either you go and you are a part of co-resistance and you're part of solidarity against what's happening, or probably we shouldn't be going. And I put that forward not because I am sure about that, but because that is the conversation now happening on student university campuses. And I throw that into the mix to think about, well, then how does Israel tour look if that's
Absolutely.
If that's what it is?
I think.
Sorry, that was just a drosh, an interpretation of your question, but I hope it.
Thank you.
It
Great question. I see. I'm not going to let you do that just because I see two more questions, and I think, in a way, what Leah has identified, and something that Keith said also, is that there is more of a challenge than I think sometimes we want to believe. When Keith said there's just Jews, I'm a congregational rabbi who come across many Israeli families who say, I never identified as a Jew when I was in Israel, and I will now. So it isn't even so simple to say it is only Jews, because there are these concepts that we are having to negotiate, and whether, as David suggested, we lose the word Zionism, or when we talked about diaspora, Leah said something so interesting, do we want to think of centers anymore? Surely there's something much more fluent about where our inspiration comes from. So I just throw that out to the panel to be thinking about as we gear. We have two more questions, and then we'll be gearing to your last words. One more question. One more online. So Paul and Etty, as brief as you can.
Just thinking about 75 years ago and the emotional hatikva, meaning hope. So I'm just wondering what the new hope is going to be.
Thank you. Let's take your question and Etty's question and the one online, and we'll try and answer.
I'm Israeli. I've been here for many years, but doesn't change it. And I was wondering if there's another, I want to ask a question from the other position. So I wrote it down so I get it right. So a big part of the problems that we're seeing now of the state of Israel comes out of it being defined as a Jewish state. And maybe it would be better for Israel not to be a Jewish state. How do you guys feel about that?
Thank you. So far, so just hold these in your head, panelists, as I turn to Charlie. We've got hope. What is the new hatikva? We've got, could Israel be Israel without being known as a Jewish state? Charlie, you want to offer the last question from online?
Thank you. So we've got two questions, and I'll put them both and you can choose which ones you take. So we have one that says, some people think that modern Israel should not exist, should never have started, that Zionism should not have prospered as a movement. How do the panelists feel about this? And then we have another which says, despite the title of this session, this whole discussion has been about Israel. Would the panel agree that many of the most significant Jewish sites worldwide are not in Israel? For example, the Torah, most of the tribes of Israel come from Haran, modern day Turkey. Jacob becomes Israel at the Jabbok River, modern day Jordan. Lots happens in Egypt. The biblical scholarship paved the way for progressive Judaism, came out of Germany. And today's center, and there we've got the word center again, point of progressive Jewry is the US. There are plenty of places for meaningful youth bonding trips with Jewish content than going to Israel.
Thank you, Charlie. So I'm going to ask each of you to respond, and perhaps you'll respond to the question that touches you most. Yair, if I can ask you to do that, and know that it's probably your last chance of a proper response.
Okay, so first, whether Israel should never have been established, etc. I don't find this a very productive way to think. And I see Zionism historically as a reaction, as a product, as much as its own thing. And it's very clear that, what made Israel viable was 300,000 Jews that fled Central Europe in the 30s, and and including my own grandparents. I don't know what it means to say, oh, it shouldn't have happened, but it's not really meaningful to me. And I think the question is, what we can have some ethical view of the past, but we have to have a view more important about the present and the future. Second, about Israel as a Jewish state, it's not an abstract concept. It should be understood that it's a constitutional setup. People talk about it as if it can mean anything. No, it means something very specific in Israel, which is even more so after the nation state law. And when you talk about a Jewish state, you need to understand that you're talking about this, not about what you think should be a Jewish state. And that state structure is highly discriminatory. So in that sense, I think it's completely legitimate position to say that you're against that constitutional thing that is called a Jewish state. If Israel just called itself an Israeli state, it would still be very much Jewish. I think there's no risk of there. And I think basically a democracy should be a state where all citizens are, part of the democracy. So that's my view.
Just very briefly, Yair, do you feel differently about Israel living here? Do you feel that you have gained a different perspective by living amongst Jews here? I don't know if you identify or feel engaged as a Jew here.
Yeah, I do feel, I kind of, for various reasons, I feel engaged as a Jew here, but that doesn't really change. What changed my attitude to Israel is lots of things, my historical research, my Palestinian friends, my ongoing conversations with people in Israel. That's what changes it.
Thank you. Okay, Leah.
So I'm not really interested in Israel if it's not Jewish, not more than I'm interested in the Czech Republic or Germany. And, the reason I picked those is because I'm both a Czech and a German citizen. I don't really read daily German newspapers anymore. I definitely don't read Czech newspapers because I don't speak any Czech. I'm not interested. If Israel is not Jewish, I'm not interested in it, right? Like then I would be interested in wherever else we do this experiment of being a sovereign people, of Jews trying to be sovereign, of actually having power to enact, not being a minority. I do think that there is a creativity and a learning that comes from a place of majority that you never get in a minority. You just don't. It's just fundamentally different. I think we see this, by the way, in all religions. Religions are practiced very differently, and the creativity that emerges from them when you live them as a minority is very different to when you live them as a majority. It doesn't mean that one is necessarily better than the other, but I think Judaism, just like all other religions, are entitled to that experiment of not just being, what does it mean to be Jewish majority? And I understand that brings politically certain challenges with it, and so on, but nonetheless, I think what kind of also got a little bit lost in the conversation today, because we spent so much time on thinking about the challenges, is actually the unbelievable creativity and learning that emerges out of Israel. It's not a coincidence that Rabbi Leah Jordan also spent significant amount of time studying in that land, because there is opportunity there that you don't get in the same way anywhere else. And I think that is something, for me, in a sense, that is kind of the new hope, right? That we don't lose that because we focus all our energy on the political fight. That is not to say that we mustn't also focus on the political fight, but it's, for me, I'm a rabbi for whom social justice lies at the heart, but my rabbinate isn't just about social justice. And I think that's for me about Israel too. Yes, my social justice passion when it comes to Israel is there, but it is also liturgical inspiration, learning, and so on. And I do want to say one thing about kind of this question about Jewish youth, and are they turning away from Israel, or are they getting more extreme? I think part of the challenge of, and this is, I would tie that in with my second new hope, is I think unfortunately we live in a very polarized world, and what happens in polarized debates is that both sides push each other to the extremes. I think we all know this from when we get into a passionate argument about something completely banal with our partners, right? Like you kind of get so entrenched in your position that you start fighting more and more, and then you suddenly realize, I don't even believe in that stuff anymore. And I think one of my hope is that we start learning to have conversations again without drifting in polarization, without pushing each other to the extremes. And that's something we need to, as a society, work on. Can we bridge that gap of polarization?
Thank you. And I think I'm a great believer that rupture and difficulty bring out more. And so I'm sure that you find, as I have, that even our dissent or not liking questions is part of the conversation and how we struggle with it at times, which is a positive thing. Keith.
So the question about what the new hope was or should be, look, all this will pass. All this will pass. The nations, in Jewish terms, in terms of Jewish history, the nation state is a here today, gone tomorrow thing. Do you really think there are going to be nation states in 3,000 years' time, 5,000 years' time, 10,000 years' time? Now, short of the coming of Mashiach, we have to prepare for the long term. Now, this isn't criticism of Zionism necessarily, or indeed of anti-Zionism, diasporism, or whatever we want to call it. But one of the things that deeply worries me about the Jewish community in the last few decades is we have bet everything, except perhaps at the margins, substantial margins, nonetheless, but margins. We have bet everything on the possibility that there will be an Israel, that it will be a safe haven, and that it will be a liberal democracy. But the question isn't whether Israel is those things or should be those things or whatever. The question is, should we ever be betting on the continued existence of any one particular socio-political formation? And I think Jews, we should always be keeping part of one step back from any here today, gone tomorrow trend, whether that is nationalism, whether that is anything. Because we should be in it for the long term. So I don't know whether nation states will exist in 10,000 years' time. I think they almost certainly won't. I don't even know that the land we call Israel will even exist given climate change and other issues like that. What I do know, though, is that we should be preparing on the basis that they won't. Fortunately, Jewish history shows that we are the most unbelievably resourceful people, and we have survived multiple catastrophes. We have lived under every kind of political system, and we will thrive under a political system in 10,000 years' time.
Thank you, Keith. It's really interesting at this point to be reminded that the Dalai Lama is recorded as having spoken enormous amount, not just in The Jew and the Lotus, but tells the story of asking the Jewish community how the Jewish community has survived in exile as a way of advice to the Tibetan community in Dharamsala. So that certainly offers us the long view, Keith. Leah, I am going to ask you last to respond. A reminder for all of us here, the notion of hope, the notion of the state as a Jewish state. Should Israel, was it worth creating? Did it need to? Surely there are other places more important for Jews than Israel. Those are the questions that we are responding to, but feel free to respond to anything at this point.
Sure. I'm going to try to kind of respond to all four of those points. I think that there is one way of looking at Jewish history, and I'd be interested in the people on this panel who definitely know actually more Jewish history than me, if this is of any use, which is that there's always been kind of a bipolar, two poles or a dialectic. So you have the Babylonian exile, which starts really even before the fully formed Jewish identity comes into existence. So you have Babylonia and Eretz Yisrael, and that lasts through the two Talmud, right? That's why we have the Eretz Yisraeli, the Palestinian Talmud, and the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. And then you shift over the course of a little while in Jewish terms, as Keith is pointing out, rather than actually a little while, to Sepharad and Ashkenaz, to a center of Jewish life that is very vibrant in Central Europe, that kind of started by going up the Rhine, from my understanding is from the Mediterranean basin, and you have the Jewish communities under Muslim empire in southern Spain and Andalusia and in North Africa, and those two poles. And now it's arguable that we have the pole of North America and Israel. Sad to say we are in neither of those places, and yet there is great Jewish life. But I also take Rabbi Leah's point. There are places where it's hard. Kansas City, I can speak as one from the margins, was beautiful in many ways, and there was a day school, and there were two kosher butchers, and now there are no kosher butchers, right? It's a very, complicated thing to be on those margins. So that's one kind of polarity or way of thinking maybe of diaspora and Zion right now, is actually those two. Those are North America and Israel-Palestine make up something like 90% of the Jewish world now. As to the question of sovereignty in the land, it's really interesting because Rabbi Leah and I have had this discussion on panels. We've had this discussion as moderator and panelist. We've also had this discussion over coffee in St. Pancras Station. And I always leave thinking, this is a frustrating just difference of emphasis maybe. But I feel something quite disturbed by the talk of Jewish sovereignty, because how I experienced that, and I don't think this is not what you're saying, right? But as that we are ethno-supremacists in the land is how that feels, that is played out. And I say this as somebody who also, I find the conversation interesting, because Leah is also right. There's a lot of Torah there because there are a lot of Jews, right? And so I've gone a lot of times to drink from that well of Torah. And I guess that brings me to my final point, which is what is the tikva? What is the next hope? I think for me, it is something about sort of the antithesis to the Jewish civil religion in which I grew up, which was that the shul on this bima, if you were in my hometown shul or any American Jewish shul in 1995, would have had an Israeli flag and an American flag. That's what would have been behind us, probably actually on this panel. They would have just sat over there in the corner behind the LJ banner. And I think that was a hollow Jewish center, like American nationalism and Israeli nationalism. And it has to be something that actually is deep and Jewish and countercultural to the majority cultural that we all share. That should be the tikva, the hope. And so I put to you, it's Torah and the Masoret. It's something to do with the textual history we have in common, and the Masoret, the spiritual tradition that we have in common. That has to be the tikva that you even can unite us in disunity, because I'm sure we would all have some great heated debates over what the heck those things are and whether we like aspects of them or not. So I think that's where I'll end.
Thank you, Leah. So in a way, our panelists have confirmed for us that the binary or the dialectic of these two notions, these two ideas of diaspora and Israel or Zion is very much alive. And I think the reason why our conversation led us down the path of Israel and Zion is because it is so it's so prescient for all of us in how we talk about our Jewish identity. For me, I keep thinking about the quotation from the prophet Jeremiah, where Jeremiah talked of to give you a future and a hope. And that verse was the verse that Rabbi Leo took when he came out of the flames of Europe to create and was given the opportunity to create a rabbinic school here in London that was to educate and prepare rabbis in Europe, rabbis, scholars in Europe to serve the community. And it is, it's with great poignancy that I think the three of us as rabbis were trained and ordained from there. Keith teaches there, as I mentioned in introduction. And actually, we are all, and Charlie, who is hosting on Zoom, all of us are products of that future and hope that has really allowed this country, certainly as one part of the diaspora, not in North America, but to flourish, to enable us to have these healthy, robust conversations about where we are, about where we're sending our children. I look at David, whose three sons led Israel Tour, led Kadima, that all of us are tied up with our youth movement, with what we want. We want there to be a future and a hope for those that come after us. So I really thank you all for being part of this conversation. I hope that we managed a sense of intimacy as we disagreed and wrestled with the term. Israel, of course, means wrestling with God. So there is God with us on the bima right now, Jeffrey. So as always, I thank Leo and Andy for doing the text so beautifully, our own Josie for holding the fort over there, Tom for holding it all, and Charlie at home as well. So thank you all for coming, and thank you to our really thoughtful panel that really wrestled as they should tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the show.
Thank you for moderating. And join us at the demonstration on Friday. Can we plug the demonstration? Do join us at the demonstration. It's from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. I know at least Rabbi Aaron Goldstein is speaking at 9 a.m. So if you're in the early crowd, I believe it's going to be Downing Street. 5 p.m. Kabbalat Shabbat at the demonstration. Join us.
And Leah, I'm right that if everyone attaches themselves to the WhatsApp group, then they'll get the address exactly of where they go as of last week.
Thanks all. Thank you.